Yeah, I'm just putting that up. Okay, pay attention, please. Did the timer already start? Okay. So we're going to talk about a problem today that's universal and affects everybody in this room and in this world, and that's the growing problem. So the growing problem of agricultural production and food accessibility in the world. So right now there are about 1 billion people in the world who don't have stable or adequate access to food. And with a world population that's expected to reach 9 billion in the next 15 years, this is a problem that we really need to address sooner rather than later. So the question then is, how do we utilize a finite amount of resources in order to essentially double food production while reducing the impact on the environment, on our natural resources, and on our world economy? So I'd like to introduce you to two farmers. John, an American farmer, like most farmers in the developed world, has adequate access to technology and resources that make his farming profitable and efficient. On the other hand, Oni, like most farmers in the underdeveloped world, don't have these same resources, and as a result, he is significantly underproducing on the land that he has. Important to recognize, though, is that both farmers are having a detrimental impact on their environments. About a third to a half of all food they are producing is never consumed and goes towards food waste. In the developed world, this is happening at the consumer level, mainly due to a result of overconsumption, whereas in the developing world, it's happening en route to the consumer, due to lack of refrigeration, sanitation, and transportation technology. Another important thing to consider is the fact that not all food is created equally. Meat production, specifically beef production, uses a disproportionate amount of food and agricultural resources in comparison to the amount of energy that it actually creates. 75% of farmable land is being used for livestock, and eating beef is 24 times less energetically efficient than eating grain. So we really need to prioritize feeding people rather than feeding animals. Also currently, we are using over 7,000 times the volume of the Empire State Building in water every single day. In developed countries, this is happening due to overwatering in excess, whereas in developing countries, crude irrigation infrastructure is allowing to water pollution and loss of perfectly good water that could be used for drinking. Another important thing to consider is the use of fertilizers and manures in farming. In countries like America, where fertilizer is being used in excess, it's running off into freshwater and coastal ecosystems and causing pollution. Whereas in developing countries, insufficient nutrients in the soil are leading to a much lower crop yield. Also important to consider is the problems this causes with natural cycles like the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. All right, so we've just gone through a bunch of the problems associated with agriculture in our world today. So now we want to switch towards looking at what are some of the possible solutions. So we see the solutions as an agricultural intensification of the systems already in place and a change in the way that we see food and our sustainable eating habits. So right now we have enough cropland to cover all of South America, and we have enough pasture land to completely cover Africa. So we do not see any need to go and deforest more of the tropics in order to create what is essentially really low yield land. What we really need to do is shift away from focusing on the amount of land that we have and change and focus towards improving the quality of the land that's already being used. So one way to do this is to solve the Goldilocks problem. And that means regulating and reducing the amount of fertilizers and manures used in the first world in order to reduce pollution, while making fertilizers and manures more accessible to those in the developing world, so that they can increase their crop yield and increase the amount of food available on a global scale. Another place where the Goldilocks problem is an issue is in water. So the first world really needs to stop overusing water in farming and reducing this precious resource. While in the developing world, we really need to focus on improving irrigation infrastructure so that the water that they have isn't wasted, polluted, and it can actually get to the farmland and produce greater crop yield and increase the amount of food available globally. What's really important, though, is individual change. If we were to completely eradicate all of our beef today, we could feed 4 billion more people. Important to think about is the fact that right now we're prioritizing feeding animals over people, and this is essentially going towards only feeding the wealthiest people in our world. But really, really important what we can do is to shift away from a culture of overconsumption and waste. We need to become more aware and more conscious of how many of the world's resources we are using, how much food we are consuming, and how much we are wasting. And then in the developing world, we need to make technology and agricultural resources more affordable and accessible so that we can increase crops in the developing world. So what can Johnny and Oni do to solve these problems? For John, it's a reduction and a regulation of fertilizer, water, and other natural resources. While for Oni, it's going to become an implementation of technology that needs to be available and accessible on a global scale in order to increase crop yield from where it is currently, which is about 50% in the developing world, to 100%. So we think that these problems can be completely solved without the use of any genetically modified organisms or crops. Through an agricultural intensification of the systems already in place, we can feed 9 billion people while reducing the impact on the environment simply through shifting towards more sustainable eating habits and agricultural intensification. Thank you.
So